Starting webinar in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Hello, and welcome to our Advanced Reserve Concepts webinar. This webinar is sponsored by Association Reserves, Inc. My name is Jen Johnson, and I'm the marketing coordinator for Association Reserves. I'll be serving as your moderator for today. Advanced Concepts is a 45-minute webinar that was developed based on questions we received after other webinars and other live speaking events. It was clear there were many board members and managers who grasped the basic reserve concepts, like the 3 levels of service and the 3-part test defining what a reserve component is and isn't. But we're still looking for something to help them implement a reserve plan at their association or the ones that they manage. So keep those comments coming. They really help us give you the programs that you want. Now, due to the number of people attending today, everyone has been muted, but you can ask questions at any time by typing your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your control panel. We will be answering your questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the broadcast, so type your questions and we'll get to as many as time allows. This webinar is approved by the Community Association Managers International Certification Board for 1 CE credit related to the CMCA certification. I will email certificates of completion to all attendees within 1 week of this webinar. Please keep in mind that the credentialing committee tracks how long you are on the webinar. Now it's time to introduce our speaker. Our host today is Bryan Farley, President of Association Reserves Colorado. Bryan has completed over 3,000 reserve studies and earned the Community Association Institute designation of Reserve Specialist. Since 2011, Bryan has served all types of properties and associations, ranging from international high-rises to historical monuments. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to you, Bryan.
Well, thank you for joining me today. This presentation will cover a few advanced concepts about reserve studies. But before we start, let's talk about why do we care about reserve studies and why are they important? So let's just imagine that you're sitting in a board meeting and perhaps maybe this is a brand new community for you, or maybe you were just elected onto the board. And now it's reported that there is a large window in one of the units that is leaking, and it needs to be replaced for about $10,000. So of course, you are asked, what do we do? Everyone looks at you waiting for your response, right? What do you do? And so that's our goal today, right? I want to give you the training that you need to know on what your priorities are and how to minimize or eliminate situations where you don't know what to do. Now, as previously discussed, I'm Bryan Farley. I'm the president of Association Reserves Colorado. And regarding this topic, I enjoy kind of eliminating some of the issues that we see, right? Because a lot of what we're talking about today, this is all psychological stuff, right? Finances can be a very emotional decision. And so I really want to equip you all, based upon my experience of doing this for almost now, I think almost 15 years of doing this, completing over 3,000 reserve studies. How can we communicate this concept of reserve studies effectively? And so when we talk about reserve studies, we're mostly dealing with community associations. And now the community association concept of homeownership can be fragile. It relies on untrained volunteers. And these untrained volunteers, which are the board members, right, they tend to cycle through every 2 years. And then you also need the participation of owners. But remember, the owners are incentivized to keep their expenses as low as possible, right? That's really normal. They don't want to pay more than they have to. However, it's the reliance on those same owners that is required to fund anything and everything at the association, which is always going to be expensive. So community association living is not really that carefree at all, right? Sometimes it's advertised to be carefree. So we need to appreciate that participating in an association will be an uphill challenge. Also, there are constant financial pressures from ongoing expenses and ongoing deterioration. And this is going to cause friction between the board and the management that is trying to lead the organization forward. And owners potentially are hanging on to the premise of inexpensive and carefree living. So it's always going to be a high pressure situation. Managing and leading your association will be an uphill challenge. There are many financial, physical, and operational decisions that we're going to be facing on an ongoing basis. And this is going to take a lot of time and effort, and there are many ways we can get this wrong. And sometimes it's just the subject of the reserve study can create conflict, right? We hear objections like what you see on screen on a regular basis, right? What's it good for? Isn't it just a bunch of guesses? Why should we pay for something that we're only going to put on the shelf? Or why should I care at all? Why do I care if we need a fund for the roof? When the roof's replaced, I won't live here anymore, right? Or maybe they're going to say to you, well, why are we getting a reserve study? We already know it's going to tell us that things are out of in bad shape or out of service, and this is only going to make my dues go up, right? These are very common objections. So how do we frame this conversation so that we can have buy-in for all of your owners? Well, let's think of a reserve study as a map for the future. It's setting you up for success. And remember that the costs that we incur at our property are going to occur whether or not we make our reserve transfers, right? The costs of our projects are defined by the property, not by the funding plan on the reserve study. You are going to be paying those costs either with reserve funding or with special assessments. The funding choice does not change that you have these costs. A reserve study is ultimately a budgeting guide. And of course, our goal is to be as close as possible with our projections. But of course, it's not going to be perfect, right? For example, if I could predict the future with 100% accuracy, would I be doing reserve studies? Probably not, right? I'd hopefully be in Wall Street or something like that. So think of the reserve study as a good framework for making decisions on how much money to set aside, how much to spend and when, right? How can we stay on track? It helps us prepare for those inevitable and predictable and expensive common area projects. Now, like that navigation app on our phone, no one is telling you that you have to follow your reserve study. Ultimately, it is a recommendation and it's not an obligation. But it does allow you to prepare for those big projects so that you can prepare financially. Now, let me make it clear. We're not making guesses about things that are going to occur in the future. We just see things for how they are now. And then based on what we see now and with regular reserve study updates, we can then help you prepare for the future. Now, what I'm talking about today is not something that I've just made up. In fact, the reserve study profession is built on the National Reserve Study Standards that define component selection, calculations, and terminology. The more your reserve study provider follows the National Reserve Study Standards, the more accurate and stable and useful the reserve study you're going to get. In addition, after the collapse of the Champlain Towers, CAI came out with a clear best practice recommendation for with-site visits to occur every 3 years. So every 3 years for updating a reserve study in order to determine how to pay for your largest budget line item, which is going to be your reserve transfers, this is a prudent decision to make. So now that we've set the stage, we talked about the reserve studies, we talked about some of the things you may see and some of the objections you may hear about with the reserve study. Let's get started in talking through some of the ways to set you up for success in your next meeting. So, what are some of the problems that we can just avoid in the first place? Well, number one, let's not make statements that we cannot support. So when it comes to a reserve study, it is much better to communicate to the owners in your meeting, well, let's take a look at the latest reserve study and see what it says about that question, rather than just saying, well, I think reserves are great, or maybe it's no problem if we let that project slide another year or two. Rely on your experts. People can and most definitely will misinterpret your well-intended comments. Therefore, always go to the source, the reserve study or your reserve study provider. And here is an example of a client that I recently worked with that was confused on what they should be doing. If you see on this reserve study summary, we are suggesting to the board that they keep their reserve transfers similar to what they are currently contributing, right? So they're currently putting away about $669,000, and we're recommending that they transfer $670,000. However, when we published the reserve study, I immediately received a message from the board asking me, how can we get to a higher percent funded as soon as possible? Do we need to special assess? Should we special assess? But as you can see, I don't recommend a special assessment on this reserve study. So why did they think that? Well, because they were ultimately looking at the percent funded, and their percent funded was low. However, just because the percent funded is low does not mean they need to special assess, right? Think of your percent funded as a lagging indicator, but your reserve transfers are a leading indicator, telling you where you're headed. So this client, I had to reassure them that they are already on the right track. They just need to stay the course, keep on putting monies away into their reserve account year after year, and ultimately they're going to get out of this high risk position into a lower risk position. Most of the issues caused here was this client had done a large remodeling project, which also included some one-time code upgrades for their systems. These are projects that are not anticipated to occur again. They were just one-time expenses. And so their reserve account took a hit. However, all of their assets at their property were then going to be brand new. So yes, right at this point, they're underfunded. However, very shortly, they're going to be in a a medium and then well-funded position where there's going to be a lower risk of special assessments and deferred maintenance, right? So again, just because it says that they're poorly funded does not mean they're in bad shape, right? So a quick call was able to explain this to the board and they were on their way. Now, another problem we can avoid is just using dated information. So think of a reserve study like you would a banana or an avocado, right? These are perishable items. Therefore, update your reserve study and get fresh information. Everything from 3 years ago, if you have a reserve study from 3 years ago, it is now very out of date. It has missed a lot of inflation. Therefore, the best practice is to update your reserve study every year. This is not a requirement, but the costs will change each and every single year. And to prove this point, in a review of 19,000 of our most recently completed reserve studies, we found that special assessments, which is an easy to measure event, dropped by 35% when an association updated their reserve study more frequently than every fifth year. In addition, special assessments dropped by 28% when the organization updated their reserve study more frequently than every third year. So updating your reserve study will give you the most accurate information and then reduce special assessment risk. Having fresh information, right? Imagine if you received a bid proposal to replace your roof from 5 years ago. Would the vendor take that bid now? Or would they tell you, hey, you need to get a fresh bid using today's dollars, right? Everyone knows the answer, right? But the same thing occurs with your reserve study. Now, another reason to update your reserve study annually is because your operational costs are also increasing. So based on an April 2023 CAI SNAP survey that represented at least 10,000 communities, it found that 91% of these communities had insurance premium increases. 50% of these respondents had to then raise their dues to pay for increases. And then 7% of them had to special assess their owners. The organization needs to collect the assessments on time so that the insurance can be paid and the HOA assets are insured. Failure to collect the assessments from the members of the community could put the homeowners at risk of losing equity in their homes if a disaster were to occur and the property was uninsured or underinsured. Another problem that we can avoid is delaying projects, right? So while it may not feel like spending money is actually saving money, right? Some people say, well, if I'm not spending the money, I'm actually saving money. But remember, in most cases, doing a project on time is a good idea. Cost overruns are common when we wait too long. So think of the high cost of a roof leak caused by delaying the replacement of the roof, or having to replace deteriorated fencing or siding instead of just repainting it. Besides, the board's job is just to maintain the common areas, not let things slide into disrepair. Everything is expensive, but so is the cost of homeownership. And as you can see on this slide, costs are only increasing, meaning if we just delay a project, the costs are only going to go up. Since about 2020, based on the Mortenson Construction Cost Index, Denver construction costs have increased by about 40%. Now, not every single component has increased by 40%. Some components are less and some components are greater, but overall, the cost increases can really catch a board by surprise. If the projects are delayed, the costs will inevitably go up. And this will ultimately cost the owners more money in the long run. And now, if you have someone saying to you, well, if we don't spend the money, we're actually saving the money. That's actually a misinterpretation, right? That's incorrect. And so here is a visual of your percent funded, right? So you take what is in the reserve account divided by the total value of accumulated deterioration. And so what's the accumulated value of deterioration? Well, you can see that here. For a project that lasts 10 years, that costs $10,000, every year it's accumulating $1,000 worth of deterioration every single year, right? Year one, it has 1,000, not assuming inflation, just to make the math simple, but in year five, it has 5,000, in year 10, 10,000, right? So if we delay a project, we are not saving money, right? The percent funded is proportionate depending on the amount of money that's required. So every single year, you're increasing the value of deterioration each and every single year. But then once you actually spend the money, you then decrease the amount of money required. So in year 10, you need $10,000. In year 11, you're going to need potentially more due to inflation or cost of work increasing. But then once you spend that money, now you're only required to have $1,000, right? So spending the money actually does indeed help the client out by reducing their value of accumulated deterioration. So it actually helps the percent funded rather than just letting things get older and older and deferring that maintenance for that project. However, be careful also on how you spend the money, right? So don't spend reserve funds on non-reserve projects. Make sure anything that we spend reserves on is either listed as a reserve component or has been cleared by your reserve study provider. So though it may not seem like a big deal, right? A few $100,000 here or there really adds up and prevents you from having enough money to get your true reserve projects done. So reserves are not just a miscellaneous savings fund for just whatever you want to accomplish. Reserve funds are collected specifically for reserve projects. If your association is in a cash flow crisis and it needs to borrow from reserves to cover its costs, commit to restoring that cash to the reserve fund and then raise your assessments so that the operating account can now stand on its own. And sometimes we get questions about, well, is this a reserve project or is this a capital improvement, right? Because I said earlier, reserve funds are collected specifically for reserve projects. But how do we know if a project is a legitimate reserve expense or not? So here's a helpful matrix that you can save that can help you act as a guide. So for example, let's just say a client in a property, they want to add a hot tub to their property, right? Just the way I look at this, I'm like, hey, it's a patio home villa. They've got a common space in the center of their development, and they want to add a hot tub. Which is it? Is it a reserve component or is it a capital improvement? Meaning, can they spend money from reserves that they already have in their reserve account, or do they need a special assess to cover this cost, right? Which will it be? Well, let's just go through the matrix, right? Is it currently a common area maintenance responsibility? No, right? They want to put in a new hot tub. Is it a discretionary cost? Yes. Is it an entirely new purpose, use, or capability? Yes. So we've already passed 3 tests of telling us that it is a capital improvement, right? The simplest one is it currently a common area component, right? It's not. A hot tub is a brand new item. The current ownership says, well, we want a hot tub, but prior owners did not want to fund someone else's hot tub in the future. They needed to cover their costs for their roofing, their siding, their asphalt, whatever it may be. You can't then use those funds that were allocated for the roofing, siding, asphalt, and then say, you know what, we want to buy a hot tub, right? That's not a fair and equitable fair and equitable way to use the cash and distribute those funds that way. Previous owners were paying monies towards the common area assets. All right, but here's a little trickier one. let's just say we have a perimeter fence around our pool area, and we have a hard key system, right? It's a metal key system. But we're finding that it's very hard to replace those keys. People keep losing them, and we're having a hard time tracking them. Therefore, we're going to upgrade to a digital fob entry system where each owner just has a key card and they're able to just use that to get in, or maybe it's a keypad, something like that. All right, is this a reserve component or is it capital improvement, right? We're no longer going to use a hard key system. We're changing the system to a fob system. Well, how do we handle this? Well, the way I look at this is, look, is this component a common area responsibility currently? Well, the perimeter fence and the entry system, the security system, is currently a common area replacement responsibility. We are just doing a natural evolution of the existing project, asset, or system, right? The technology has changed. It has been upgraded. We no longer are using hard keys most of the time. We are now using a digital system because technology has changed. Therefore, this is a natural evolution of an existing project. This is how I would look at this, and this is how I would break it down. It is currently a maintenance responsibility. We're not changing the system. The ownership still needs a secure system to get into their pool. We just changed the technology based upon natural evolution, right? So this is a helpful matrix. Of course, if you're confused, reach out to your reserve study provider to give more context on this type of question. All right, so what's another problem we can avoid? And that is going to be neglecting your reserve transfers. So make sure that you've set your budget so that you're able to make scheduled reserve transfers. And in these times, it may mean raising your yearly assessments. However, think of it as a roof deterioration bill, an asphalt deterioration bill, right? These are real bills that need to be paid, just like the utility bill, just like the management bill, and just like the insurance premium. Think of the reserve study as a way to show your ownership, here are all the reserve bills that we need to pay each and every single year. Your operating budget, it's very simple. You can just see, hey, what's our landscaper charging us this year for landscaping or snowplow, or what's our insurance premium this year? It's very clear. With your reserves, it can be a little bit more confusing. Therefore, use the reserve study to track what the bills are, right? And we call them the deterioration bills, your roof bill, your asphalt bill. These are all deterioration bills that need to be paid on an annualized basis. And then lastly, let's not be casual about our reserve investments, right? Let's be careful, right? Not putting our money in dangerous or potentially illiquid assets, but maximize your investment returns. There's more options nowadays, particularly, than just having your funds sit into a savings account. If you're interested in this, talk to a reserve investment specialist, right? Not me. I am not a reserve investment specialist. I do not want to touch your money. However, a reserve investment specialist will be able to make the money work for the board, and they'll be able to get a better return on their investment. So now that we've talked about some of the things to avoid, what should we be focused on? What are we trying to accomplish with our reserves? And now, what is our ultimate goal? Right? So our goal is having enough funds on hand to do our scheduled projects in a timely manner, when they need to be completed and how they need to be completed. We need to remember that we cannot just spend money from reserves carelessly. And really, this is what it's all about. And so how do we know what success looks like for our reserves? Just like any game or any business, right? The score is going to be based on numbers. You need to have a plan that's based on income and expenses. We need to keep the income coming in, balancing out the expenses going out. And then additionally, there are two sets of rules that are going to affect the reserve study and your reserve fund management. And so the first set of rules that we're going to discuss is fairly straightforward, and we call it the 4 reserve rules. Number 1, expenses are always going to happen, right? There's no avoiding them. Number 2, the board is responsible to manage the assets of the association. Number 3, like I mentioned a moment ago, delays often get expensive. So don't delay and get stuck with projects that go way over budget. And then lastly, number 4 is that owners inevitably are going to get stuck paying the bills. Whether the board saves the owner's money or makes things more expensive, the owners are always going to get stuck paying the bills. And so what do I mean by that? Well, there's only four options for a project to get completed with money, right? So the only ways that you can pay for a project to get completed is number one, reserve transfers. Number two, special assessment. Three, a loan. And then fourthly is just do nothing, right? Let it go into disrepair, defer it, defer it, defer it. And ultimately, it's just going to fall apart. So we always argue that the best option for the board, the cheapest option that saves the owners most money is going to be predictable reserve transfers into the reserve account. And that's way if we can, because we know we have to pay these costs, but the cheapest way is going to be reserve transfers. Now, another set of rules that we need to talk about is the business judgment rule. So when a board's decisions are challenged, whatever they have done is then going to be checked against the three-part business judgment rule. So if all the decisions that you make, large or small, we want to make sure that we are operating according to the business judgment rule. And so what's interesting about this is that in hindsight, we can actually be wrong. But if we show that we followed the three steps in the business judgment rule, we should have a strong defense. So what are the rules? Number one is to make sure that everything that we do can be described as being completed in good faith, meaning we were loyal and responsive to the needs of the association. Number two is that we operated in the best interests of the association, meaning we didn't do anything self-serving or wasteful. And we were careful and responsible with the association's money and with the vendors and suppliers that we hired. Number three is that we acted prudently, meaning that when we weren't sure what to do, we just didn't make a guess, right? We reached out for help. And that could be from your landscaper to find out which plants we should be using, or from your accountant, your attorney, your manager, or your insurance agent, or potentially your reserve site provider, right? So in other words, no guessing. Whether you're a manager or a board member, we are not expected to know every single thing, right? You're not expected to know it all. So reach out to wise counsel. That is what we're here for. In addition, be careful about how you actually describe your reserve account or how you're striving to have money in your reserve account and using the term adequate reserve, saying, hey, we have adequate reserves in our reserve account. Be careful because in 2018, reserve adequacy is actually now a defined industry term that we use. Reserve adequacy means that your reserve plan shows that you have adequate cash to do all of your reserve projects for the next 20 years without reliance on future loans or special assessments. So think of it as being a sustainable budget plan without having to utilize exogenous sources of income. Rather, you're just using your projected reserve transfers. Now, let's switch gears here and let's talk about ways that we can now save your organization money. What are some ideas that we can implement? So you may often wonder how you can safely minimize your reserve transfers, right? You can't change your expenses because your roof is going to fail no matter how much longer you wish it would last, right? Or you can't cut the cost of the roof in half by just wishing it were half as large, right? So we need to work the income side. Let's maximize our interest earnings. And let's not be content with earning a low yield from a savings account. And so here's a kind of a simple way of looking through this. I actually ran a test of a couple clients just to see, does increasing the yield on your reserve account help the association, and then how much? And so what we found is that for every point of interest increase for an association, meaning if you go from a 1% yielding account into a 2% yielding account, there's almost a 7% decrease in average in the fully funding reserve transfer recommendation. All right, so just as like a kind of a macro level example, let's assume that our reserve account currently has $1 million sitting in a 1% interest bearing account. And then we are contributing $20,000 per month into the reserve account. So if we move monies into a new account that is now yielding 3%, right? So it's a 2-point increase. Now the organization is able to reduce its contribution rate or its transfer rate from $20,000 to approximately $17,300, right? So by moving our monies over to a higher yielding account, we are effectively able to reduce our reserve transfers. Now, I would argue let's not reduce our reserve transfers, but let's just use that extra yield, that extra $3,000 per month that we're getting, or $36,000 a year, and just use that as a cherry on top, right? That's like an additional transfer, or additional monthly transfer, you could say, right? So compounding interest is a powerful tool, right? You could say it's like what, the ninth wonder of the world, something like that. It's really amazing. And so think about that. Again, talk to a reserve investment specialist and utilize the returns that you can potentially get if you're currently sitting in a low yielding account. Now, please don't take what I'm saying as trying to out earn or out contribute by utilizing higher yields or putting your money in some sort of potentially dangerous investment vehicle. We always want to recommend our clients to be putting their funds in safe and liquid accounts, meaning the money must be available and you must not lose the principal. We want to be very, very careful. But again, there are safe, potentially safe FDIC insured investment vehicles out there where you can get a higher yield. So just look into it and be aware of these options out there. Again, I am not an investment specialist. So please be aware that you need to talk to someone who does this for a living, not me. But just so you understand, there are ways to help your association out. All right, so another idea for minimizing your reserves is completing your projects on time, right? It's very simple. I can't tell you how many times a client has delayed a painting project or a roofing project or an asphalt project, thinking that they're saving money by kicking the can down the road. However, they only were having to spend more money, potentially 50% more, right? Just 2 years later, due to inflation or due to the damage caused by delaying the expense. It is an easily avoidable mistake. And although it's about a bit counterintuitive, but associations with a strong reserve fund generally pay less towards their reserves compared to a poorly funded association. A well-funded association is able to keep their reserve transfer stable by not having to make up due to lack of funding, right? So reserves is all about the ongoing offsetting of the deterioration of the organization. So if your reserve fund is strong, all you're doing is just slightly offsetting ongoing costs. But if you're poorly funded, you're constantly having to play a game of catch up, utilizing high reserve transfers to prepare for the upcoming and expensive projects. However, if you're well-funded, you're already on schedule and you're already ready to go, and you just have to make some minor tweaks here or there because you have adequate cash already. And although it's not a big expense, there are ways to save money on your reserve study itself. So the first is just to make sure that you're choosing the right level of service. If you've already had a reserve study prepared according to National Reserve Study standards, you don't need another full reserve study. You need to choose either a with site visit or a no site visit update, and these will be less expensive. And then you can improve the quality of your reserve study by asking questions and making sure that your reserve study is fine-tuned to your association. You can do that with online software or other online reserve calculators. And then also when you're working with your provider, be involved in the process. We find that when clients answer our questions about what was done, when, why, by whom, this actually reduces the amount of time that we spend during our due diligence phase, and we're able to charge less for future reserve study updates. And some clients have voiced concerns that they don't want to influence the process, right? They want a good independent reserve study where they don't have to tell us anything. They say, we want you to do it all by yourself and see what happens, right? We understand that. We completely understand that you want us to do it independently, and we appreciate that. We have done thousands of reserve studies, and we know our National Reserve Study standards. But remember, it's our company logo that goes on the cover. We welcome all suggestions and all insights into what has happened, when, and why. However, please be aware, we know when to dig in our heels and to keep our independence. We cannot have our arm twisted just because the board wants us to change something, right? And so this is also important to remember too, as far as when a client is concerned about telling us, okay, has this been completed, right? Maybe they say, well, we want you to just check to see if it's in good shape, right? Please be aware that ultimately the reserve study is a budgeting document. We are not going to be doing forensic investigation of your assets. So we cannot do forensic testing to see was your roof installed perfectly per the code upgrades because we don't know what's going on beneath the surface, right? But on the other hand, if the board then tells us, well, we think the roof's going to last 100 years, please change your report because we got a 100-year warranty. We are then going to question that. And we're going to ask, can we please talk to your vendor? Are they really going to warranty this product with labor for 100 years, right? So we need to keep our independence where we want to ask a lot of questions. We want to have a lot of information, a lot of data, but we need to make sure that we are careful because, again, ultimately it is our logo and our stamp that goes on the front cover of that reserve setting. So another thing that we need to be aware of is inflation, right? So I talked about interest, right? And interest and inflation are both real and important, but they do not cancel each other out. And that's because your interest is earned only on the reserve funds that you have on deposit, but your inflation causes the entire value of all of your components to grow. So, for example, you may have $80,000 sitting in your reserve fund earning interest, but you also have $800,000 in reserve components that are increasing every single year due to the inflation occurring at your property. Now, on the topic of inflation, we are often asked about our assumptions on the reserve setting. And as you can see on our reserve settings, if you've worked with us before, we use 3%. Why? And so why is that? Well, 3%, if you average it out over the last 40 years, on average, the purchasing power of the dollar, the inflation rate is about 3%. Again, on average, some years it's a little higher, some years it's lower. It really depends on the year. But on average, again, we're around 3%. So then we're asked, okay, well then change it to, let's just say during 2022 and 2021, we were asked to increase it to 9%. So we had to kind of explain to clients, well, no, we can't do that. Because for every 1 point increase in inflation, in order to make up for that 1 point increase, your reserve transfer rate would then need to be increased currently by 22% to achieve the same objective. So if we were to increase the inflation rate from 3% to 4%, you would then need to change your contributions or your transfer rates by 22%, increase them by 22%. So this is going to penalize your current and near-term homeowners with higher reserve funding levels than are appropriate for your multi-year funding plan. So we don't want to just change things arbitrarily. We want to be very careful. Now, I've already talked about the delaying of the projects on your property, but I'm going to emphasize it again. There's no benefit, there's no value of delaying a project. Your expenses are still there, and delaying a project does not have a measurable effect on reducing your reserve fund obligations. It's just not worth it. Another way to minimize the costs at your property is to appropriately categorize your expenses. So a $2,000 pool heater is just as expensive to the owners, whether it's paid from your operating account or your reserves. But it is important how we allocate those funds. One way or the other, we need to collect the funds so that they can be spent. But please bear in mind, we don't want to double book the same expense so that this expense shows up on your operating budget and your reserve budget, right? And so a common issue is, let's just say, trees. We're working with a client that wants to include landscaping or trees. I always want to be careful putting those types of items on the reserve setting because most likely they're already booked in your operating budget. So we're booking them in your operating budget and your reserve budget. So you're basically double paying, or double charging your owners for this. Now, if you're in a property like a single family development where your trees every single year are draining your operating account and there's a consistent expense occurring year over year, well, then let's talk, right? We may be able to help your association out by including kind of a budget there for saying most likely we're averaging about 3 tree replacements per year. Therefore, let's allocate this much money on a yearly or every other year basis so that we're not draining your operating account. Now, if you have an owner that's confused about your operating versus your reserves, I've made this kind of simple matrix that you could utilize for your owners. So your operating account, when you think about your operating, right? If your owners, they pay their assessments, where do the monies go? So they fall into one of these two buckets. So Your operating bucket is for your recurring expenses that occur on a month-to-month and year-to-year basis. And on a per transaction basis, it's generally less than 1% of your total annual budget. And if you need to do any sort of replacement project, let's just say you have a curb or a sidewalk area that needs to be shaved down because it's a trip hazard, you're going to complete that project as needed. Whereas your reserves are also a recurring expense, but they're recurring on a much longer term time frame. And on a per transaction basis, they're going to be greater than 1% of your total annual budget. And then lastly, it is going to be a planned expense, right? It's not done as needed. We are budgeting and planning ahead for this recurring project. Now, the last way to save money is going to be by batching your reserve projects together. When it comes time to complete your projects, think ahead and then take advantage of ways to save money by doing your projects together, utilizing the economies of scale. If you need to paint your trim, paint your ironwork at the same time. If you need to seal coat your asphalt, perhaps paint the red curves at the same time. If you're replacing the furniture in your clubhouse, consider replacing the carpeting and repainting the walls at the same time. If you can combine projects, you may be able to achieve better economies of scale and then save money for your homeowners. So now that we've covered some of the ways to save money, what are some of the next steps that we need to be thinking about? So the next step is then going to be funding your reserves. But then how do we know if we've actually had success with funding our reserve study? So the best practices with respect to your reserve funding plan is first that we find that we have most success communicating to homeowners about reserve funding is if we characterize our reserve transfers as offsetting the ongoing deterioration of the property. Think of it as a current bill, just like any other bill at the association. If someone says, I don't want to pay for something that's going to happen in 10 to 20 years, please remind them, no one here is paying for something 5, 10 to 20 years in the future. All we're doing is offsetting the current deterioration 1 month at a time. And if we do that, the future will take care of itself. Reserve funding is not optional, right? Deterioration will not take a day off. Therefore, your reserve funding should never take a break either. Remember, no one is paying for something in the future. Everyone is offsetting their usage of the components while they live at the property. Once they move out of the property, they're no longer obligated to pay for this expense, right? But when they live at the property, they have an obligation to pay for their usage of all of the common area assets of the property, whether that's a roof or a pool or a tennis court. They have an obligation to pay for their usage of those assets while they live at the property. The funding plan that we design for every single one of our properties is going to be steady and smooth. And this is actually what's recommended in the National Reserve Study Standards. So therefore, make sure that you update your reserve study regularly so that any funding plan adjustments that we have to make are going to be as small as possible. But even if you're way behind, don't worry about it, right? We're going to design a multi-year exercise plan that will strengthen your reserves so that you're prepared. This could include different annual increases depending on the needs of the client, right? We want to work with the client to get them to where they need to be. And it's always going to be custom for every single property we work with. Now, another question that you may have heard in a meeting is, how far ahead will we be looking and estimating our component expenses, right? How do we know how far to go ahead? Well, based on the National Reserve Study Standards, the answer is at least 30 years of projected income and expenses are required. But the real answer is that we want to capture all significant and reasonably predictable projects that are in the future of the organization. So if you just put on a new roof that has a 40-year design life, we're going to include that in your reserve study, right? So just because it goes beyond 30 years, there's no magic 30-year limit. It needs to be included on the reserve study. All right, but what if things change with your components, right? So let's say you're putting this new roof on that has a 40-year life, but it's not the comp shingle roof that was in your prior report. You're now upgrading to a 40-year standing seam metal roof. How do we account for this in your reserve study? Well, that is why we need to update your reserve study. We may be asked, we just completed our reserve study last year. Do we really need another one? And as I've already mentioned a few times, yes, it's important to update your reserve study. But what's going to influence your decision on how often you are updating your reserve study? Well, in preparing over 95,000 reserve studies, we've learned that when we only update a client's reserve study every 5 years, it's pretty much a rescue mission. So much has changed about the component's life, the costs, and the reserve balance that it's sometimes the update feels like we're doing a brand new reserve study. The component, the costs, the conditions, the reserve fund balance has little resemblance to the prior reserve study that we put together. And what about those clients that hires every third year? Well, we generally categorize those as reserve study adjustments. And then lastly, we're going to have clients that hire us every single year. Now, in almost all of those cases, the results are just going to be minor tweaks, right? The reserve funding plan will not get off track too much. So as we're drawing this presentation to a close, I just want to make sure you all are aware of where to go if you have more questions. So first, take a look at online resources, websites, there's podcasts, there's videos all about reserve studies. All this information is going to be free and available to you. Additionally, there are trade organizations with luncheons and programs pretty much everywhere in the country where you can learn from speakers and others in the audience, helping you avoid mistakes and then avoiding having to reinvent the wheel. And then finally, there is going to be in-house training. If you have a management company that you're working with, reach out to them. And then lastly, if you want more training like this, reach out to your reserve study provider and see if they're available to do some sort of online or potentially in-person training. So as we come to an end here, ultimately, the choices that you make are going to create the future for your association. So your future will either be a place like this, right? The Aspen Creek Condo Association that is sloppy, disorganized, and mismanaged. Or it could look like a place like this, right? Well-maintained and on its way towards a safe and secure future. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I do appreciate it. I hope I was able to provide value and answer some of the common questions that we see and also prepare you for your next board meeting.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'm going to pass it back to Jen now, and she will be able to let me take a sip of water here and start answering some questions that were put into the chat. So Jen, would you mind taking over?
Yeah, no problem. Great job, Bryan. And thank you so much. All right, everyone, as control panel and start typing some of those questions out. But please do not type out your questions into the chat. So Q&A, not the chat. All righty, we've got our first couple of questions here. I'll let you finish taking a sip there, Bryan. All right. What are the updates on Colorado legislation for reserve studies?
Yes. So we recently, actually this month, we had a new bill come through and was signed right before the end of the legislation. So for Colorado, there's now a brand new reserve study bill on the books. So what the bill is, it's 1099, House Bill 1099. And what it says is that when a new development is being transferred over to the new board, so when they call it a declarant transfer, when a board is taking over the responsibility of the association from the developer, that developer must pay for and provide a new reserve study for the updated board to follow. So for the new board, they have to follow this reserve study. Now, the board can then choose to either take the recommendations or not, but they want it to be a disclosure document. Think of it that way. So the developer saying, here are all the reserve assets at our association. Here's what the reserve transfer should be based upon the reserve study provided by the reserve specialist. And it has to be done by a third-party reserve specialist as well. The developer hands that over, and now that is the law. Now, so note there, the state of Colorado is seeing the value and the importance of a reserve study. So it could be in the future, maybe associations, so existing associations may need to be required to have reserve studies done. Because what we're seeing is the state of Colorado is showing the value of a reserve study for helping associations not get too far behind in their budget planning. So please be aware of that. But right now, if you live in an existing association, it's not impacting you. It's only if you are moving into a new declarant controlled association. Once declarant control is transferred over to the board, a reserve study now needs to be provided.
All right. Thank you. All right, a quick reserve study question here. Should irrigation system replacements be accounted for in your reserves?
So it depends. So for irrigation clocks or irrigation controllers, these are the little boxes that you'll sometimes see throughout your property. You can open them up and you can dial them in and you can set the watering schedule. We do always fund for those. What about though your valves or your heads or sprinkler valves, sprinkler heads, those things? Maybe you see them pop up and then one's broken and so you have to replace it. Generally speaking, that would fall into our operating category as we discussed. That's going to be an as needed expense. What about the irrigation lines though? The lines underneath the ground for your association? Well, that gets a lot more tricky. And why is that? It's tricky because we can't visually see the lines. We don't know what's going on. And in fact, only when you have an irrigation vendor come out and maybe do a scope or assess to see if there's any sort of water leaking or maybe you're not getting proper pressurization, do we actually know what's going on? So you actually need to get a third party involved, like an irrigation specialist. They then can check out to see what's going on with your irrigation lines. Then they might come back to us and say, okay, the irrigation lines are compromised. We need to do a full replacement. Or they may say to us, well, we just need to do one small replacement. And so that's why we have to be careful, because there's a difference between an entire irrigation replacement and just maybe a line or two. It really is, it's really tricky. And so again, a full replacement could be over $100,000, $200,000 potentially, or a simple repair could be a couple $1,000s. So it's helpful to get a specialist out there, particularly for things that we can't see ourselves. The same sort of logic applies to your plumbing system, your plumbing or your sewer system. We cannot see those things while we're on your property. I can see the paint on your building. I cannot see the sewage lines. I cannot see the plumbing. I cannot see the irrigation lines. Therefore, if there's a concern about those, don't hire the reserve specialists to check them out. It's a different scope of work. Hire the specialists, the irrigation, the plumbers, those sorts of specialists. They're going to be able to help you with those particular issues.
All right, thank you. So Lori Forte has kind of a similar question.
Yeah,
Um, I don't know if this would already be answered with what you just said, but what about high-rise buildings with the sprinkler system and fire
yeah.
suppression? They're not currently in their reserve study.
Yeah, great question. So it does follow a similar path there. So a fire suppression system is going to have a couple different components regarding, particularly for a high rise, right? So depending on when your property was it built before 1980? Was it built after 1980? There's a couple things. How high? Is it over 6 stories high? There's a couple things that we would need to make sure that we figure out first. But generally speaking, if you're in let's say, a very large high rise, you're going to have fire jockey pump, you're going to have a control box, maybe a backup generator. And then you're going to have your fire control panel, which is a box that kind of sends digital signals to sense where things are going on. And then you're going to have your lines, whether it's a pneumatic system, whether it's a wet system, all these different types of things that we would have to kind of take into account. So what are the fire lines? These are, again, are pipes. How are the pipes going to fail? Well, maybe over time, they may or may not develop pinhole leaks. What if your lines develop pinhole leaks? Well, those need to be repaired. Well, who do you need to call? Well, you have to call potentially a piping specialist to then check that out for you. But that's a critical infrastructure question. So again, the reserve study is helpful for saying things like your fire control panel, on average for your particular property, let's just say it's $25,000 to upgrade it every 20 years. Plus, we need to put in some pole stations or strobes or things like that in the reserve study. But for the fire suppression system itself, regarding the lines itself, that's where we want to start to ask more questions. Particularly, we want to start calling your fire control panel vendor or your fire suppression vendors. That's where we're going to start talking. If you say to us, hey, we're concerned about this, my question back to you would be, have you talked to a specialist about that particular question? If so, what did they say? If they said, yeah, there's an issue, then we are now required to now talk to that vendor because we need to figure out the answers and we need to disclose it so we can budget for it. However, if you haven't done that kind of first part process regarding the lines, right? Irrigation lines, plumbing lines, suppression lines, sewage lines, electrical lines. These are things that require a third-party investigation because we're not qualified. We actually don't have the proper license to inspect these items. So we can definitely include them on the reserve study if a third-party vendor, like a third-party specialist, gives us the okay to do so. I hope that helps with that question.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, Bryan, we're kind of dwindling down on time. How about one more question? Do you have time for that?
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. So this has been a hot topic around our office, obviously. So I'm sure some people have this question. We have a listener that says, "Can you discuss the new Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac 15% threshold of funding?"
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a new guideline. So it's particularly regarded to as the condo question or condo guideline for mortgages. So when you are trying to sell a home in a condo, and again, a condo is depending on how your property is structured. Even a townhome I've seen sometimes are called condos. So we want to be careful about just understanding how your association is defined. Um, so Fannie and Freddie, who are the largest underwriters for mortgages in the US, in order to get really good rates, generally speaking, or generally favorable rates is probably a better way to put it. They have a kind of a guideline as far as you need to pass these tests depending on the type of loan you're trying to get. Now, one of their updates has been regarding reserve studies. So if your one of the first now things that they've changed is they're just going to say that your reserve transfers into the reserve account must account for approximately 15% of your total annual budget. So a lot of words there, but just think of it this way. If you look at your annual budget, 15% of that, their first question is going to say, is 15% of that going into the reserves? If not, then the second question is, do you have a recently updated reserve study that was done within the last 36 months that then shows that you're still achieving proper funding or full funding at a lower amount? So let's just say, again, I'll go through the process. You're putting away 10% into your reserve account right now. And the reserve study that maybe you got from 36 months ago says that's okay. As long as you can provide that to show that, yes, 10% is adequate, they're going to say, okay, great. So it's a new guideline that they put in. We actually have a lot more information as well, just because I know we're running out of time, on our website at www.reservestudy.com. And we try to flesh it out more there just so that you can see it with your own eyes. That might be helpful. But again, go to reservestudy.com and to our resources page. There's some information on there, particularly we even added an FAQ on our website that addresses this. That would be a really helpful resource for you all to look at right now. Again, if I've said, again, you start to add percentages, 10%, 15%, total budget, it gets confusing sometimes. So go to reservestudy.com, look at our FAQs. That's a great resource to look at.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you, Bryan. We've been updating that as soon as we get more information to help continue to educate you all. So all right. Thank you so much, Bryan. What a wonderful presentation. And thank you so much for everyone attending. That concludes today's webinar. If anyone is interested in a recorded version of this or any other of our webinars, you can search for them on our YouTube or on the Association Reserve's webinar page. If you enjoyed today's session and would like to receive the Association Reserve's newsletter or announcements of future webinars, please visit www.reservestudy.com and click the icon to sign up for the newsletter. I want to thank you all for attending. If you have any questions or if there's any way that we can be of any further service to you, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you again and goodbye.